All right, a good Erev Shvi Shel Pesach. So we know the first day of Passover, the 15th of Nisan, is a day of Yontif where a person is not allowed to do any malacha, where they're not allowed to turn on lights, they're not allowed to drive. And then we have the next 5 days, which we refer to in Hebrew as Chol Hamoed, which are days where we also celebrate and we don't fast and we don't give eulogies. However, they are days where you still are allowed to drive, let's say. And then we have the seventh day of Passover, which is like the first day of Passover, which is another day where you're not allowed to do malacha. But we mentioned by the first day of Passover that the Torah explicitly tells us why this is a day of extra holiness, where we don't do malacha, where we don't do work, which is because it is the exact day, a commemoration of the exact day that we left Egypt. But it doesn't say explicitly why the seventh day is celebrated. So if you do a calculation of the Bnei Yisrael's travels to the Midbar, you would see that the seventh day correlates to the day of the splitting of the sea, to which God split the sea, the Jewish people passed through it, and the Egyptians were drowned in it. And our rabbis tell us that that is why God instituted the seventh day as a day of celebration. So based on this, a friend of mine named Yaakov Subek asked me a great question on the Haggadah. This is in the song of Dayenu. It says, "Ve'ilu kara lanu es hayam, velohi virana b'soiche b'charava Dayenu." If he had split the sea for us and had not taken us through it on dry land, Dayenu, it would have been enough. Now that's very perplexing. You see, if somebody would have asked you, what was the purpose of God splitting the sea? You would have said the purpose of God splitting the sea was that it was a means of salvation to the Jewish people. Meaning it wasn't a means in and of itself. It was, that is us crossing through the sea, and then once we got to the other side and the Egyptians were dead, like that was the real point, was the salvation. Well, the splitting of the sea itself was a nice touch by God, but it wasn't the end-all be-all, it was the salvation that was the end-all be-all. Yet if you look at Dayenu, we're saying that we had enough to thank God just for the splitting of the sea, independent of the salvation, meaning had we not even gone through it, we would have had what to thank God, even if it meant like us dying or something like that. So that's kind of strange. What is so special about the sea splitting of the sea itself that we deserve to say thanks because of just that in and of itself? So to answer this, we have to have a little bit of Hakdama based on the Ramchal, Reb Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who lived in the 17th century, and he wrote a pivotal work called Mesilas Yesharim, the Path of the Upright. And in it, he answers the questions of like why we were created and what is the purpose of this world. And he tells us that the purpose of this world is so that we can get closer and get knowledge of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because the ultimate pleasure that a person gets is through connecting to God and coming close to Him. So the purpose of this world, so to speak, is to build up closeness to God and to find ways to connect to Him and come closer to Him and to gain more knowledge of Him. There is no greater joy that a person can get than knowing God. Just the knowledge of God is the greatest joy a person can receive. Now look at the actual song the Jewish people sang at the sea. Aziv the strength and the retribution of God was the cause of my deliverance. This is my Almighty, and I will glorify Him, the God of my father, and I will exalt Him. Look at Rashi's commentary. Rashi's commentary on the right side says Ze'eli. Now in Hebrew, the word Ze implies something that's pointing, like you have the ability to see it and point at it. And we find the rabbis use that type of drasha many times. And so Rashi says, "Bekavodo nigla lechem b'hayu marino yitzoi be'etzba'a, and ra shifcha alayam masha lo rou nevim." Now, Rashi says, I can't explain it fully because it is seemingly somewhat esoteric, and he's basing himself on a medrash. It's not like he made this up. But he writes, "In his glory did he reveal himself to them, and they pointed to him, as it were, with the finger exclaiming, 'This is my God.' And a servant at the sea beheld even what the prophets never saw." So what he's saying is implied by the word zeh in Hebrew, means that the Jewish people had such a clear vision of God that they were literally able to point and be like, oh, that's God. No prophets that came afterwards, Isaiah, Yehezkel, Yirmiyah, none of them had that level of prophecy where like, oh yeah, look, there's God, point. Okay, none of them had that level of prophecy. You know what their level of prophecy was? They would like fall asleep and see visions, and they had to decode these visions, which we call like Ruach HaKodesh or something like that, right? They were still prophets, and they were great, and they saw things that we never saw. But even the lowest maidservant that was at the splitting of the sea was able to say, oh, yeah, look, there's God, which is a much higher level of prophecy. Now, what does it mean to say, oh, look, there's God and point? Right? I don't know. I mean, that's a very esoteric thing to say. And we're treading on like whatever they call it, like treading on water or whatever, by saying such a thing, anthropomorphisms. But whatever it is, we can know that for sure the people at the sea saw something greater than any of us have ever seen, and any people, even that came before us, saw, except for that generation that was at the sea. And we just said that knowledge of Hashem is the greatest pleasure a person can receive. And knowledge of Hashem is like the purpose of this world of creation. So now we can understand these words in Dayenu. If he had split the sea for us and had not taken us through it on dry land, Dayenu would have been enough. Meaning the amount of knowledge that we received by seeing the sea split, and at that moment we received such a level of prophecy that we knew God more than anybody else in world history. It didn't matter now if we survived. We reached the ultimate level of pleasure and the ultimate purpose of this world at that moment at the splitting of the sea. So whether we lived or died at that moment, like, didn't matter anymore. So what are we celebrating on Shvi Shel Pesach? We're celebrating the idea, the reaching of knowledge that no people has ever come to before, that our ancestors, who are us, we are them, received. And who is like the Jewish people? Mi ka'amcha Yisrael. This is why the Jewish people, like, we're such an academic and such a learned people that we have a holiday, so to speak, this holiday, which is just basically on, if you really think about it, what I'm saying is we're commemorating knowledge. We're commemorating that we received some sort of knowledge. We're not commemorating a salvation. We're not commemorating, I don't know, getting rich or something. Shvi Shel Pesach is such a beautiful and such an intrinsically Jewish holiday because it commemorates knowledge. All right. Have a good Shvi Shel Pesach.